What could be so serious that a king and his heir acted before dawn? That question alone sent a ripple of tension through the palace walls, a tension that few outside these gilded halls could ever truly understand. It was 2:47 a.m. when the first whispers of alarm began circulating through the quiet corridors of the palace, the kind of whispers that immediately make you question every assumption you've ever had about loyalty, trust, and power. The lamps in the halls flickered dimly, casting long shadows across portraits of ancestors whose faces had witnessed centuries of secrets and scandals, but even they had never encountered a night like this. The corridors, usually serene at this hour, suddenly felt charged with a kind of electricity that signaled something irreversible had occurred. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine the scene. The palace, typically a bastion of routine, filled with the hushed urgency of advisors, aides, and security staff, all moving in a choreography of urgency and discretion. Phones were silenced, secure lines buzzed with activity, and somewhere, in the privacy of a sealed office, the king and the heir convened in a meeting that would define the course of their reigns. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Every movement, every glance carried the weight of consequences that extended far beyond the walls of this historic residence. And yet, the general public remained blissfully unaware, asleep in their beds, unaware that a decision of monumental significance was unfolding while they dreamed. This wasn't a simple disagreement or a routine policy adjustment. No, this was an immediate reaction to a discovery that could not wait. The decision made in those tense hours would strip privileges, alter perceptions, and redefine the relationships between family, duty, and the institution itself. And yet, the nature of the discovery remains shrouded in mystery. Was it a financial discrepancy? A breach of protocol? Something more personal? The speculation alone has sent historians, royal commentators, and curious citizens into a frenzy. But what makes this truly captivating isn't just the act itself. It's the reason behind it, and the consequences that ripple outward like a stone dropped into a still pond. Why should you care? Because royal privileges are not merely ceremonial. They are the lifeblood of monarchy. They represent power, trust, access, and the right to act in ways ordinary citizens can't even imagine. To strip them away is to question loyalty, competence, and judgment at the highest level. And when that act comes in the dead of night, it signals urgency, secrecy, and the potential for fallout that could echo through the corridors of power for years. This is not a trivial matter. It is a turning point, a moment in which the balance between family loyalty and institutional integrity hangs by a delicate thread. Consider for a moment the psychological weight of such a decision. The king, Charles, long known for measured patience, had to act swiftly. His son, William, next in line to the throne, was forced to confront a reality that challenged his perception of family and duty simultaneously. Every advisor in the room knew the stakes, and yet every one of them had to operate under a veil of discretion. The tension was palpable. Imagine the internal conflict: a king committed to the dignity of his office, an heir compelled to uphold its future, all while contending with emotions that would tear at any ordinary human heart. How do you reconcile the love of family with the obligations of monarchy? It is a question that has haunted royal dynasties for centuries, and tonight, it demanded an answer. The scene was fraught with contradiction. On one hand, there was the rigid structure of protocol, the forms, the rules, the centuries of tradition that define what a monarch can and cannot do. On the other, there was human reaction, alarm, fear, a sense of betrayal, perhaps even anger. Short, sharp bursts of conversation punctuated longer, deliberate silences. The tension wasn't only in what was said, it was in what was left unsaid. Advisors watched, listened, and occasionally exchanged glances that betrayed the unspoken thought. This is unprecedented. Nothing in our training, nothing in our experience, has prepared us for this night. And what of the discovery itself? The details are murky, yet even the outlines are enough to ignite the imagination. A discrepancy, an anomaly, a secret exposed. Whatever it was, it carried the potential to destabilize not just the immediate family, but the institution as a whole. Consider how many layers of protection exist within the monarchy. legal safeguards, security measures, historical protocols. For something to penetrate all of that and demand immediate action suggests that the stakes were higher than anyone outside those walls could ever comprehend. And in those moments, decisions are made not in the cold logic of law, but in the hot, messy swirl of human emotion. Every choice becomes amplified, every consequence magnified. Now, let's pause and consider the broader implications. Why does this matter to you, sitting miles away from the palace gates? Because institutions like the monarchy are mirrors, reflecting both stability and vulnerability. When a king acts decisively, it is not just about who gains or loses privileges. It is about the message sent to the world. Authority, integrity, and continuity are on display, but so too are the human flaws that threaten to undermine them. The public perceives the monarchy as timeless, unshakable, untouchable, but tonight, all of that perception was in jeopardy. And that is where the drama intensifies. History is not written by the moments that go unnoticed. It is written by nights like this, where tension, secrecy, and revelation collide in ways no one can predict. The human element cannot be overstated. Imagine sitting in a room with two of the most powerful people in the kingdom, watching them process information that could redefine roles, relationships, and legacies. The advisors and staff were not mere bystanders. They were actors in a drama that would ripple outward, influencing policy, perception, and perhaps even the fate of future monarchs. Every glance mattered, every hesitation counted. It was a night where instinct met protocol, and emotion clashed with duty in the most intimate, high-stakes arena imaginable. One misstep could reverberate through the palace walls, the media, and the public consciousness, altering narratives for generations to come. And then there was the matter of timing. Why act in the dead of night? Because urgency demands discretion. Because hesitation could be interpreted as weakness. Because certain truths, once allowed to linger, gain momentum and become uncontrollable. The decision to act immediately, without consultation beyond a trusted inner circle, demonstrates not only the severity of the discovery, but also the calculated approach to containment. Yet even in this calculated approach, human emotion seeps in. Fear, frustration, perhaps even sorrow. These are not abstract figures in history books. They are living, breathing humans confronted with truths that challenge their understanding of loyalty and authority. The palace itself, with all its grandeur, becomes almost a character in this unfolding drama. The long, echoing hallways, the ornate chambers, the centuries-old portraits, all bear witness to a tension that is both modern and timeless. History may record the stripping of privileges as a procedural act, but for those inside these walls, it is an intimate, emotional upheaval. Every shadow seems deeper, every sound more significant. Every step taken in those hours carries the weight of consequence, and every decision has the potential to alter trajectories not only of individuals, but of an institution that has survived centuries of scrutiny. And as the night stretched on, one thing became clear. Whatever was discovered could not be ignored, and whatever actions were taken could not be reversed. This was the beginning of a sequence of events that would demand courage, clarity, and an unflinching sense of responsibility. Yet even in the midst of this urgency, questions lingered. Who was truly affected? How much of this will the public ever know? And what unseen forces were now set into motion? The tension is almost unbearable, but it is precisely this tension that captures the imagination and ensures that the story will not simply fade into history. It demands attention. It demands engagement. And it demands a reckoning. But as dawn approached, and the first hints of light crept across the palace grounds, one thing remained certain. The night had changed everything. The discovery, the decision, the human reactions, all of it had been recorded in ways that would resonate far beyond the walls of the palace. And yet, the most dramatic revelations had not yet been revealed. What came next would set the stage for a series of events so extraordinary that even those who were present could not fully predict the outcomes. And this is where our story truly begins, in the quiet, electric moments just before history takes its next turn. The night is far from over, and the consequences of what was found will continue to unfold in ways no one could anticipate. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if I told you that one night could rewrite the balance of power within the British monarchy? That's exactly what happened on this fateful evening, the kind of night that palace walls rarely witness. The clock had just passed 11:50 p.m. when the first signs of unusual activity rippled through the corridors. Security teams, typically methodical and quiet, were now moving with a silent urgency. Phones buzzed in private rooms. Whispers echoed from corners where usually only the ticking of clocks punctuated silence. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the palace, two of the most powerful people in the world were about to confront a discovery that could not wait for daylight. Imagine walking down those long, echoing corridors, the floorboards creaking softly underfoot, only to find that every whisper, every glance, carries the weight of monumental consequence. The palace is not just a home. It is an institution, a symbol of continuity, tradition, and history. Yet, tonight, even centuries of protocol could not shield it from the shock of what had been uncovered. Every step, every decision, every conversation in that night's unfolding drama would ripple outward, affecting not only the lives of those inside, but the perception of monarchy itself. The night began innocuously. Staff were completing their usual evening duties, security teams were making routine rounds, and the air was calm, almost serene. But then, an anomaly emerged. A document, a report, a piece of information that, on its surface, seemed ordinary, yet its implications were anything but. It was the kind of discovery that starts with a quiet hum, that escalates to a whispered "this can't be right," and finally erupts into full-blown alarm. And when alarm reaches the upper echelons of monarchy, there is no room for delay. Decisions must be swift, precise, and controlled. Have you ever wondered what it's like to witness history as it happens? Not through the filtered lens of media, not from the comfort of hindsight, but live in a room where every heartbeat seems to echo with consequence. The palace staff did. Advisors, aides, and senior officials found themselves thrust into a maelstrom, balancing discretion with urgency, loyalty with duty. Every glance, every movement was calculated. Even breathing seemed to carry weight, as if exhaling too loudly could tip the delicate balance of what was about to unfold. As the clock edged past midnight, the tension became almost tangible. Conversations were clipped, punctuated by long pauses as each participant weighed words carefully. Information was delivered in fragments, analyzed, and then reanalyzed. The atmosphere was a mix of fear, anticipation, and disbelief. What was initially thought to be a minor irregularity quickly escalated into something far more serious. And when the king himself was summoned into the room, the gravity of the situation became undeniable. Think about the psychology of that moment. A king, a son who is the heir, and a team of advisors, all trying to parse a reality that defies expectation. Every historical precedent was pulled from memory, every protocol reviewed, every potential outcome considered. And yet, no precedent truly prepared them for what they were facing. The rules of monarchy are extensive, codified over centuries, yet the human element, the fear, the disappointment, the shock, cannot be fully legislated. And in that charged environment, every decision had a dual impact, immediate and far-reaching. Meanwhile, outside the private chambers, the palace itself seemed to hold its breath. Security measures intensified. Gates were monitored with unusual scrutiny. Every hallway and corridor, every room and passageway became a theater of vigilance. The ordinary routines of palace life, the ringing of phones, the quiet footsteps of night staff, the turning of keys and locks, were replaced by a heightened awareness of potential consequences. Imagine walking those halls, knowing that any misstep could have repercussions beyond comprehension. By 1:15 a.m., the gravity of the situation demanded action. The king, fully aware of both the immediate need and the long-term implications, made a decision. A consultation with his son, William, and the inner circle of trusted advisors. This was not a casual meeting. This was a gathering designed to assess, evaluate, and act without hesitation. Documents were reviewed, cross-checked, and debated. Every possible scenario was considered: public perception, legal ramifications, family dynamics, and the historical weight of precedent. And yet, Even in this controlled environment, emotions ran high. The heir, trained to balance duty with personal attachment, found himself confronting a reality that challenged his assumptions about family, loyalty, and the responsibilities of the crown. Advisors whispered in corners, some with hesitation, others with urgency. And through it all, the discovery, the anomaly, the catalyst, loomed over every decision, an unseen force shaping every move. Shortly after 2 a.m., the first steps toward resolution were taken. Privileges were discussed, not merely symbolic titles, but access, authority, and influence. The implications were staggering. To strip privileges in any circumstance is serious. To do so in the dead of night, in response to an immediate discovery, is unprecedented. The gravity of such an action cannot be overstated. And yet, despite the procedural rigor, the human drama was impossible to mask. Tension, fear, disbelief, all coexisted in the same room where decisions were being finalized. By 2:30 a.m., a consensus was emerging. The king and his son had aligned on the necessary steps. The advisors, while cautious, acknowledged the urgency. The palace staff, already keyed into the unusual activity, prepared for implementation. Every detail was double-checked, every potential error accounted for. And through it all, the sense of history being made was palpable. Those present understood that they were not merely handling a procedural issue. They were witnessing and shaping a defining moment in the life of the monarchy. What adds even more tension is the unpredictability of public perception. The monarchy operates on a delicate balance of transparency and discretion. How much should be revealed? What can remain private? Every action taken in these late-night hours would have consequences not only within the palace walls, but for the public, the media, and the global audience that watches every royal move. The pressure to act decisively, while managing optics, is immense. One miscalculation could spiral into a narrative of scandal, incompetence, or betrayal. And then, just when it seemed that a plan was taking shape, an unexpected complication arose. An advisor discovered an overlooked detail in the documentation, a nuance that could alter the interpretation of the discovery. The room fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned toward the documents, toward each other, and toward the king and his son. It was a moment charged with the tension of suspense and anticipation. How would this affect the already momentous decision? Would it delay action, or would it escalate the urgency even further? At this point, the night had become a crucible. It tested loyalty, judgment, and the ability to make swift decisions under pressure. The king, known for measured patience, had to reconcile his desire for thoroughness with the need for immediacy. The heir, balancing personal loyalty with institutional responsibility, had to navigate the delicate line between family and duty. And the advisors, who had prepared for crises both mundane and extraordinary, were now participants in an unprecedented situation where every decision carried the weight of history. By 2:55 a.m., the first formal steps toward action were taken. Orders were issued, communications prepared, and security measures adjusted. The late-night discovery had transitioned from a puzzle to a directive, and every move from that point on was deliberate, strategic, and irreversible. And yet, despite the careful planning and controlled execution, the human element, the emotional tension, the anticipation, the fear, remained raw and unfiltered. The palace, usually a place of calm in the late hours, had been transformed into a theater of anticipation and suspense. Each hallway, each chamber, each quiet corridor became a stage for history in motion. The decisions made during these hours would define not only the immediate response, but the narrative of how the monarchy addresses crisis, betrayal, and the delicate interplay between tradition and modernity. And then, just as the first hints of dawn began to soften the shadows across the palace grounds, a realization struck everyone in the room. What they had discovered was only the beginning. The immediate action, the careful deliberation, and the dramatic stripping of privileges were merely the opening act of a story that would continue to unfold in ways no one could predict. Every consequence, every reaction, and every future decision would be informed by what had transpired during these critical hours. And so, As the night drew to its uneasy close and the palace began to awaken to a day that would feel anything but ordinary, one thing became clear. The night the palace didn't sleep had forever altered the rhythm of monarchy. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What do we really mean when we talk about royal privileges? Is it jewels, palaces, or lavish lifestyles? Most people imagine ornate tiaras, gilded carriages, and glittering banquets. But the truth is far more complex and far more powerful. Royal privileges are not simply perks. They are lifelines of influence, access, and authority. They define who can do what, when, and with what consequences. And when those privileges are stripped, even partially, it is not just a symbolic act. It is a declaration. Loyalty and trust are no longer guaranteed, and consequences are immediate. Imagine holding the power to influence a centuries-old institution with a single decision, knowing that the boundaries of authority are enforced not just by law but by centuries of tradition. Now imagine that power being quietly, suddenly, and irrevocably taken away. That is what it means to have royal privileges revoked in the dead of night, in response to a discovery so urgent it could not wait for daylight. This is not ceremonial drama. It is a seismic shift in power dynamics, one that reverberates through every layer of monarchy. At the heart of these privileges lies access. Access to private communications, sensitive documents, security clearance, and even the intimate knowledge of who moves through the palace and when. Privileges confer the right to act with authority in ways ordinary citizens can't imagine, approving events, managing budgets, influencing ceremonial procedures, and even shaping public messaging. Take away those privileges, and the person is effectively fenced off from influence. They are still part of the family, yes, but their ability to affect the institution is dramatically curtailed. Consider for a moment the subtle but profound power of a title. Titles confer not only prestige, but also responsibility. A duke or duchess is expected to uphold certain standards, maintain visibility, and act as a representative of the crown. They are allowed privileges that extend far beyond the material, permission to engage with leaders, influence charitable work, and participate in ceremonial duties that shape public perception. To strip a title, or to suspend the associated privileges, is to remove someone from the visible and invisible machinery of monarchy. It is not merely symbolic, it is operational. But privileges go deeper than titles or ceremonial duties. There are financial components, discreet yet significant, that allow certain family members to operate effectively within their public and private roles. The line between personal wealth and institutional funding is nuanced, tightly regulated, and historically protected. To revoke access to these funds, even temporarily, sends a strong signal about trust, responsibility, and accountability. It says, your actions have consequences, and even family members are not exempt from the rules that govern the institution. And yet, the monarchy is not just a system of privileges. It is also a system of relationships. Stripping privileges affects dynamics at every level. The personal relationships between family members, the operational relationships between staff and royals, and even the symbolic relationship between monarchy and public. Think about it. When someone suddenly loses access to privileges they assumed were theirs by birthright, the message is unmistakable. It is a lesson in power, in consequence, and in accountability. And in the context of this late-night discovery, the lesson was made swift and irrevocable. What makes this scenario even more compelling is the rare nature of such actions. History is replete with examples of monarchs taking decisive action to protect the institution, but the removal of privileges is reserved for exceptional circumstances. It is not a tool wielded lightly, nor is it applied as a public spectacle. It is a surgical act, precise and deliberate, intended to address an immediate issue while signaling to all parties that boundaries exist and must be respected. In other words, it is a line drawn in both practical and symbolic terms. This far, no further. Audience, ask yourself, how would it feel if everything you assumed about your place in a system, your rights, and your responsibilities was suddenly called into question? Imagine being a member of a family where your role is codified not just by affection but by centuries of expectation, and then discovering that a single discovery has altered your authority. Fear, disbelief, and urgency all collide in ways that are both human and institutional. And this is exactly the emotional crucible that the palace faced that night. Even advisors, who are trained to anticipate crises and manage risk, found themselves navigating uncharted waters. Protocol dictates certain courses of action, but protocol assumes a level of predictability. A late-night discovery disrupts predictability entirely. Now, not only must decisions be made immediately, but their impact must be measured across layers of history, precedent, and public perception. Every word matters, every document matters, and every decision can ripple far beyond the immediate context. And here is a surprising fact. Many of the privileges we think of as ceremonial, access to palaces, participation in events, permission to represent the crown, carry real legal and operational weight. They dictate who can sign approvals, who can access sensitive correspondence, and who can influence decisions that affect not only the royal family, but entire charitable organizations and public initiatives. Removing these privileges is akin to quietly pulling someone out of a high-stakes game while leaving the rules intact for everyone else. The impact is profound, immediate, and unmistakable. Humor can even play a role in understanding the absurdity of it all. Imagine a family dinner where suddenly one family member is told they can no longer sit at the head of the table, cannot access the family vault, and cannot speak for the family in public events. The shock is personal and emotional, yet it mirrors the operational reality of monarchy. Privileges are not just perks, they are power, and their removal is a statement as much as an action. The palace, as an institution, has mechanisms to handle emergencies. Advisors are trained to anticipate leaks, miscommunications, and reputational risk. Yet, even in this controlled environment, the late-night decision to strip privileges carries an element of unpredictability. Staff must adapt, schedules must be rearranged, and communication channels recalibrated. The ripple effects extend through the household, affecting daily routines, security protocols, and even the psychological environment of those who work within the palace walls. Direct question to the audience. How would you react if suddenly, without warning, a lifetime of assumed authority and access was revoked overnight? The mix of fear, confusion, and urgency is almost palpable. And this is the human side of monarchy that rarely reaches the public eye. Privileges, while institutional, are also deeply personal. They define identity, responsibility, and place within a system that is simultaneously family and institution. To remove them is to confront the individual with the stark realities of consequence and accountability. Consider, too, the symbolism of stripping privileges. History shows that monarchs who act decisively send a message that transcends the immediate situation. It is a demonstration of control, integrity, and adherence to standards. The late-night timing amplifies the impact. Acting immediately, while discretion is maintained, signals the seriousness of the situation without turning it into a public spectacle. And in this particular night, the message was crystal clear. No one, regardless of family ties, is above accountability. And yet, for all the procedural precision, there is a raw, emotional core to this act. Imagine the heir, William, realizing that the privileges he had assumed as a natural part of his family role are now being questioned and curtailed. Imagine the king, Charles, balancing the weight of history with the immediacy of crisis. Imagine the advisors, trained for emergencies but confronted with a scenario that defies precedent. The human stakes are immense, the emotional tension high, and the consequences potentially life-altering. By 2:30 a.m., as final decisions were being formulated, the gravity of what had been undertaken became clear. This was more than a symbolic gesture. It was a structural realignment, a recalibration of authority and influence, and a demonstration of institutional self-preservation. Privileges had been stripped, and with them came a powerful message. Boundaries exist, and even family is subject to them. The palace, once a haven of stability, had become a theater of accountability and revelation. But what made this moment even more extraordinary was the anticipation of consequences beyond the immediate family. The public, the media, and the historical record would eventually learn of the severity of the action, but not yet. At that hour, the palace held its breath, balancing secrecy with the need to act, and anticipating the ripples that would inevitably reach far beyond its walls. Privileges had been removed, but the full story was only beginning to unfold. And so, as the night slowly gave way to early morning light, one thought lingered in the minds of everyone involved. Privileges may be assumed, inherited, and taken for granted, but once removed, they cannot be simply restored. The impact is permanent, the message undeniable, and the consequences far-reaching. What seemed like ceremonial action was in fact a defining moment, one that would shape relationships, influence perceptions, and alter the course of the monarchy itself. But even with this understanding, the night was not yet over. What had been discovered, what had prompted this unprecedented action, and how the affected individuals would respond remained uncertain. And that uncertainty, the question of what comes next, was about to set the stage for events that no one could have predicted. The most explosive discoveries are often accidental. It begins with a small detail, something that doesn't quite fit, something overlooked, something dismissed as routine. But then the discrepancy grows in significance, until suddenly it cannot be ignored. This is exactly how the late-night revelation unfolded in the palace that fateful evening. No one expected it. No one anticipated the consequences. And yet, by the time the first alarmed whispers filled the halls, the gravity of what had been uncovered was undeniable. It started innocently enough. A routine review of documents, audits, and communications, as any institution of this size and historical importance would perform. Advisors were sifting through paperwork, checking approvals, and ensuring that every process adhered to centuries-old protocols. It was meticulous, tedious work, the kind of task designed to keep the wheels of monarchy turning smoothly, unnoticed, behind the grand ceremonial facade. But then, something unusual caught an advisor's eye. A line in a ledger, a note in a file, a record that simply didn't align with expectation. Have you ever noticed something that seems minor at first, only to realize its implications are enormous? That is exactly what happened here. A single anomaly, almost trivial at first glance, triggered a cascade of questions. Why was this document here? Why was it overlooked in previous reviews? Who had authorized it, and on what basis? Each question compounded the tension in the room. Advisors began cross-referencing, double-checking, and then triple-checking. The sense of unease grew. Something was amiss. And in a palace built on centuries of order, even the smallest irregularity is amplified. By 11:58 p.m., the anomaly had escalated into a full-blown alarm. The initial, this is odd, transformed into urgent whispers and rapid-fire exchanges. Staff who had been methodical in their work now moved with a quiet urgency, aware that something significant was unfolding. Phones buzzed, notes were exchanged, and a secure line was activated to notify key members of the inner circle. The king himself, Charles, was soon briefed, and the heir, William, was pulled into the situation. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to touch, heavy enough to make each participant aware that this was no ordinary discovery. What made this discovery particularly dangerous was its nature. It wasn't just procedural. It wasn't merely an oversight or a clerical error. It was something that, if left unaddressed, could ripple across the institution, undermining trust, exposing vulnerabilities, and calling into question both judgment and loyalty. Imagine the panic of realizing that a minor detail, overlooked for perhaps months or even years, could suddenly destabilize an entire system designed to endure centuries. That is exactly what the palace staff and the royal family were confronting in those harrowing moments. Emotional tension escalated quickly. Advisors exchanged glances, their faces betraying disbelief and concern. The king, accustomed to navigating crises, felt a rare surge of urgency. The heir, though trained to balance personal and institutional loyalty, was confronted with a situation that challenged assumptions, forcing him to process the revelation with both head and heart simultaneously. Short sentences filled the room as facts were exchanged, juxtaposed with longer, contemplative silences as the weight of the discovery sank in. And then there was the question of scope. How far did this discovery extend? Was it limited to one individual, one department, or one decision? Or did it reach deeper, potentially implicating multiple actors and processes within the palace? These were not questions with easy answers. The ripple effect was unpredictable. Every action taken in response would have to be calculated carefully, balancing urgency with discretion, power with restraint, and personal feelings with institutional duty. Interestingly, some advisors initially resisted the gravity of the situation. They had been trained for emergencies, for scenarios both routine and extraordinary. Yet this discovery defied expectation. No protocol covered the full ramifications. No previous case had prepared them for the convergence of risk, family dynamics, and institutional consequence. The unusual nature of the finding only heightened the tension. What had been a routine night of work transformed into an unprecedented crisis. Every participant understood the stakes. And yet, the details remained shrouded, known fully only to a small, trusted inner circle. Direct question to the audience. How would you react if a discovery you stumbled upon, accidental, seemingly minor, suddenly had the power to redefine relationships, authority, and legacy? It is a terrifying position, yet one that members of the palace were forced to inhabit. As they sifted through the documentation, rechecked cross-references, and validated facts, a picture began to emerge. This was no ordinary discrepancy. It was a signal of something far more consequential, something that demanded immediate action. By 12:20 a.m., a consensus was emerging. The discovery was too significant to delay. Immediate action was required. But even in that urgency, careful deliberation was essential. To act impulsively risked further destabilization. To act too slowly risked allowing consequences to spiral beyond control. Advisors debated, the king considered, and the heir weighed options, all while managing the emotional charge of the revelation. This delicate balance between decisiveness and restraint underscored the unique complexity of monarchy. Every decision is both personal and public, both symbolic and practical. Here's a surprising fact. Discoveries like these rarely become public knowledge. The monarchy, after all, thrives on the perception of continuity and stability. Revelations that could be perceived as scandalous, destabilizing, or disloyal are often managed quietly, internally, and with precision. The late-night hours are a preferred window for such interventions. Minimal attention, maximal discretion. And that is exactly what occurred here. While the palace seemed silent to the outside world, inside, a whirlwind of evaluation, consultation, and decision-making was in full swing. Yet the human element remained unavoidable. Imagine being the first to notice the discrepancy, realizing its implications, and then knowing that your next steps would trigger actions affecting kings, heirs, and the broader institution. Anxiety, fear, and responsibility collided in a high-pressure environment. Advisors and staff were acutely aware that mistakes could not only be embarrassing, they could have lasting consequences on the monarchy's reputation and function. Each choice carried weight, each word could influence outcomes, and every hesitation risked allowing the situation to escalate further. By 12:45 a.m., the full scope of the discovery was becoming apparent. It was not limited to procedural irregularities. It reached into the core of privilege, authority, and trust. The anomaly exposed vulnerabilities that demanded a response calibrated to both institutional integrity and human relationships. To address the matter required not only procedural action, but personal intervention from the king and the heir. Decisions were no longer theoretical. They were immediate, tangible, and irreversible. And yet, even as plans were formulated, an underlying tension persisted. How to act decisively without generating panic, suspicion, or public scrutiny. The monarchy operates in a delicate dance, balancing secrecy with transparency, authority with relatability. Stripping privileges, even privately, risks sending a message beyond the walls of the palace. Staff and advisors were acutely aware of this, weighing every potential repercussion while implementing the necessary measures. By 1:30 a.m., it was clear the discovery could not remain contained. Action had to be taken, privileges had to be revoked, and boundaries reasserted. This was no longer merely an internal procedural matter. It was a moment that would define the night, the family, and the institution for years to come. Every participant understood the gravity, and every movement was deliberate, controlled, and charged with consequence. And yet, in all of this careful planning and urgent action, one thing remained unpredictable: human reaction. The individuals whose privileges were about to be stripped were not yet aware of the full extent of the discovery. Their responses, emotional and instinctive, were a variable that could neither be fully anticipated nor controlled. The tension between revelation, action, and human emotion created a volatile environment, one in which every decision carried amplified impact. By 2 a.m., final steps were underway. Privileges were formally suspended, lines of communication were tightened, and security protocols adjusted. Advisors briefed the king and the heir on potential consequences. The anomaly had triggered action that was swift, decisive, and irreversible. And yet, the night was far from over. The discovery itself, the catalyst for this upheaval, remained only partially revealed to the outside world. Its full implications were still unfolding, quietly, within the private chambers of the palace. Imagine standing on the cusp of history, witnessing the first reactions to a discovery so powerful it redefines relationships, authority, and trust. The advisors, the king, and the heir were all there, navigating unprecedented challenges while balancing discretion, duty, and emotion. The anomaly had become a turning point, an event that demanded attention and reshaped the rules of engagement. And the consequences? They would ripple far beyond the walls of the palace, affecting not only the family but the institution and the public perception of monarchy itself. But just when it seemed the immediate response was complete, an unexpected complication emerged. A secondary detail, previously overlooked, demanded reassessment. Advisors realized that the anomaly had broader implications than initially thought. Rooms went quiet again. Decisions were paused. The tension in the palace grew, thick enough to feel, as everyone understood that the night's discovery was only the beginning. What had been uncovered was not a single event. It was a web of interrelated facts, relationships, and privileges, each influencing the other in ways no one could yet predict. And so, as the early hours of morning approached and the palace remained awake with anticipation, one truth became clear. The discovery no one was looking for had set in motion a chain of events that would redefine authority, loyalty, and consequence within the royal family. It was not just a revelation. It was the catalyst for a night that would echo far beyond its walls. And the next step, the next action, and the next reaction would all hinge on how this discovery was interpreted, managed, and acted upon. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. For William, this wasn't just a matter of protocol or duty, it was personal. Imagine the pressure of standing at the threshold of monarchy, the weight of centuries of expectation pressing down on your shoulders, and then being confronted with a discovery that challenges not only your judgment, but the trust within your own family. He had been trained, meticulously, for situations of crisis and public scrutiny. But nothing, no training, no preparatory exercise, could have fully prepared him for the late-night revelation that demanded immediate action. It begins with awareness, understanding that the anomaly discovered in the palace is more than a procedural concern. It is a signal, a symptom of a breach that affects the very fabric of responsibility, authority, and trust. William knew that ignoring it, even for a single hour, could have catastrophic consequences. Delays could be interpreted as weakness. Hesitation could erode public confidence. And most importantly, failure to act would have sent a signal within the family that boundaries were negotiable, that privilege could shield indiscretion. For William, there was no choice. Action was necessary, swift and decisive. But the decision was not purely strategic. The human element, the personal conflict, was unavoidable. William is not merely a public figure. He is a son, a brother, and a member of a family whose private dynamics often mirror those of ordinary households, amplified by the scrutiny of the world. To confront a breach, to enforce boundaries, to strip privileges, is to navigate a minefield where family loyalty clashes with institutional duty. Each step carries emotional weight. Each conversation carries personal risk. How do you reconcile filial affection with the responsibilities of monarchy? William was forced to answer that question in real time, under pressure few could comprehend. Consider the psychological burden. standing in a room with the king, advisors, and aides, all analyzing the anomaly, knowing the clock is ticking, knowing that public scrutiny may follow, and knowing that a misstep could alter both perception and reality. William had to balance several competing forces simultaneously. The immediate need for decisive action, the preservation of family dignity, and the safeguarding of institutional integrity. Each force exerted pressure, and each demanded consideration. The weight of expectation is almost unimaginable, and yet William bore it with measured urgency. Direct question to the audience. How would you act if the person whose privileges were under review was someone you loved deeply, someone whose choices you could not control, but whose actions could imperil everything you were preparing to inherit? This is the dilemma William faced. It is the kind of moment that tests character, judgment, and emotional resilience. In those quiet hours, far from public view, he was forced to confront not just the anomaly, but the implications it carried for his own future. What made the situation even more delicate was timing. The late-night discovery left little room for deliberation. By 1 a.m., the evidence had been validated. By 1:30 a.m., advisors had presented their assessment, weighing risks and recommending action. And yet, William could not ignore the emotional landscape. How would family members react? What alliances and conflicts were latent, waiting to surface once privileges were stripped? The stakes extended far beyond procedure. They were personal, human, and volatile. William's decision-making process reveals a fascinating duality, the convergence of instinct and analysis. He had to rely on his training, drawing from historical precedent and procedural knowledge, while simultaneously trusting his intuition about human behavior. Advisors could offer data, documents, and precedent, but the subtleties of loyalty, emotion, and family history were his alone to interpret. How does one weigh centuries of tradition against a single night's discovery? The answer lies in the blend of caution and courage, analysis and empathy. Emotional tension escalated further as William confronted the implications for public perception. As heir to the throne, his actions are scrutinized far more than most. To act with decisiveness is expected, yet any hint of overreach, insensitivity, or favoritism could be criticized. He had to ensure that the response to the discovery was not only effective but defensible, measured, and strategically aligned with the institution's long-term stability. Every choice was magnified, every consequence amplified, and the weight of potential missteps pressed heavily on him. A surprising fact, even the most minor revocations of privilege in modern monarchy carry ripples of historical precedent. Past incidents, whether disciplinary or corrective, are rarely forgotten within palace walls. Advisors often reference them when guiding decisions, reminding the heir and the king that action has consequences that extend beyond the immediate situation. William was acutely aware of this context. The anomaly was not just a disruption. It was a signal that history could repeat itself, and the response must be both timely and judicious. The personal stakes became apparent as the night progressed. William was not merely observing the anomaly. He was implicated by association. As a family member, he shared responsibility for maintaining integrity, trust, and public confidence. Ignoring the breach would have compromised not only the monarchy's operations, but his own position as heir. Acting decisively, however, risked personal tension with family members affected by the privilege removal. It was a high-wire balance between duty and emotion, one that few outside the palace walls could truly appreciate. By 2 a.m., William's clarity crystallized. The anomaly could not be ignored. Privileges would have to be revoked, lines drawn, and boundaries enforced. Yet, he understood the human impact. The person whose privileges were stripped would feel the consequences profoundly, both emotionally and socially. It is one thing to enforce rules in an organization. It is another to enforce them within one's own family, where love, expectation, and history collide. The night demanded both courage and sensitivity, precision and compassion. Think about the irony. William, groomed for leadership, trained for crises, and prepared for public scrutiny, now faced a scenario where personal judgment was inseparable from institutional responsibility. Advisors could offer guidance, documents could provide clarity, and protocols could suggest procedures. But the ultimate responsibility rested with him. Each decision carried emotional, relational, and operational weight. He had to navigate complex layers simultaneously, ensuring the response was effective, fair, and aligned with both personal and institutional expectations. The late-night hours also brought a heightened awareness of consequence. In such moments, small errors can become amplified. Miscommunication, hesitation, or overreaction could destabilize relationships, jeopardize public perception, or even weaken institutional authority. William understood that the ripple effects would extend far beyond the immediate night. Each action would be scrutinized, each decision analyzed, and each outcome remembered as part of a narrative that stretches back centuries. Direct question to the audience. Could you separate personal loyalty from duty when the stakes are this high? William had no choice but to do so. The anomaly demanded action that transcended familial affection, reaching into the realm of institutional preservation. To act decisively was to risk personal conflict. To delay was to risk irreparable institutional harm. The tension between these extremes is what defined the night. By 2:30 a.m., the decision-making process had concluded. William, in consultation with the king and advisors, agreed on the necessary course of action. Privileges would be stripped, boundaries reinforced, and consequences communicated in a controlled, strategic manner. Yet, even as the plan solidified, the personal cost lingered. Emotional tension remained palpable. The act was correct, necessary, and defensible, but it was also profoundly human, affecting relationships, trust, and perception in ways that could not be fully anticipated. And so, as the early hours of morning approached, William found himself at a crossroads. Balancing familial loyalty with institutional responsibility, weighing public perception against private consequences, and navigating a landscape shaped by both historical precedent and human emotion. The night demanded leadership, clarity, and courage, all of which he exhibited. But even with action taken, one truth remained. The reverberations of this decision would be felt long after the night had ended. And just when it seemed the immediate response was complete, another revelation loomed on the horizon. A detail previously unnoticed, a consequence unanticipated, a reaction waiting to unfold. The next steps, the next challenges, and the next emotional reckonings were still to come. But what came next would test not only William's judgment, but the bonds of family, and no one could predict the outcome. For King Charles, the night was a crucible of responsibility. Every monarch inherits not just a crown, but the accumulated weight of centuries of history, tradition, and expectation. And when a discovery of this magnitude arises, the weight of that responsibility becomes almost tangible. It is a moment when personal judgment, institutional duty, and historical precedent collide, leaving no room for hesitation. The anomaly discovered in the dead of night was not merely a procedural concern. It was a challenge to everything Charles had worked to uphold: his family, his legacy, and the integrity of the monarchy itself. Imagine standing in the private chambers of a centuries-old institution, knowing that a decision made in these hours could ripple through history. Charles had been trained for decades, observed protocol, studied precedent, and navigated crises large and small. Yet nothing could fully prepare a monarch for the visceral reality of enforcing boundaries within one's own family. It is one thing to act decisively as a head of state. It is another entirely to act decisively against a family member, stripping them of privileges that were assumed to be theirs by birthright. The emotional weight was immense. Charles, like any parent, felt the pull of love, loyalty, and family bonds. And yet, as king, he had to prioritize the crown over personal sentiment. Advisors can recommend, staff can provide intelligence, and protocols can offer guidelines, but the final decision rests with the sovereign. Every action carries both immediate and long-term consequences, shaping the institution, public perception, and the dynamics within the royal family. It is a burden few could imagine, and one Charles bore with the deliberation and gravity befitting his station. Direct question to the audience. Could you make a choice that might alienate family to protect an institution? For Charles, there was no alternative. To ignore the anomaly, to delay action, or to prioritize emotion over duty would have jeopardized not only the monarchy's credibility, but the very stability of his reign. This is the paradox of leadership at the highest level. Personal feelings must be subordinated to institutional imperatives, and the stakes are always immense. The discovery demanded immediacy. By 12:45 a.m., advisors had presented the facts, assessed the implications, and proposed a course of action. Charles, well aware of the historical weight of his decisions, understood that delay could compound risk. In moments like this, time is both an ally and an adversary. A few hours of indecision could escalate a minor issue into a crisis, yet hasty action risks miscalculation. The balance is delicate, the pressure immense, and the consequences irrevocable. One of the unique challenges Charles faced was navigating precedent. Monarchs before him had confronted breaches of protocol, loyalty, and authority, but few had faced such a combination of personal and institutional stakes. Advisors reminded him of historical instances where decisive action preserved the crown, as well as cases where inaction led to scandal or erosion of trust. Charles had to weigh each reference carefully, ensuring that the decision he made honored tradition while addressing the immediate challenge. The human element was unavoidable. This was not merely a matter of policy, it was a personal reckoning. Charles had to consider the emotional responses of the individuals affected, the impact on his relationship with his son, the heir, and the potential reactions of the broader royal family. Even the most controlled environments cannot fully contain human emotion, and Charles understood that enforcing the removal of privileges would generate tension, resistance, and potentially lasting friction. Yet he also knew that leadership required action, often at a personal cost. By 1:30 a.m., Charles had formulated a plan. It was measured, deliberate, and precise. Privileges would be stripped, boundaries reasserted, and communication managed carefully. Advisors would implement the procedural aspects, but the authority of the decision rested squarely on the king. Every word, every directive, every choice carried weight, and the stakes extended beyond the immediate night to the future stability of the monarchy. The symbolic importance of the action cannot be overstated. Stripping privileges is more than an administrative act. It is a declaration of values, standards, and accountability. Charles's decision was a signal to the royal family, the staff, and the public. The crown is protected, the rules are enforced, and loyalty matters. In an institution where perception is as critical as procedure, this message had to be unmistakable. And yet, delivering it required tact, strategy, and emotional intelligence. Missteps could ignite controversy or weaken authority. Interestingly, the process of enforcing privilege removal is a delicate choreography. Advisors must coordinate legal, operational, and security measures while respecting the personal dignity of those affected. The king must convey authority without alienation, decisiveness without cruelty, and clarity without spectacle. In this case, Charles navigated all three with remarkable poise, balancing the procedural and human dimensions in a high-pressure environment few outside the palace could comprehend. The late-night timing was strategic. Acting under the cover of darkness allows for discretion, minimizes immediate public exposure, and provides the space for careful implementation. Yet it also magnifies tension. Individuals affected may feel blindsided, uncertainty is amplified, and emotions are raw. Charles understood these dynamics, and he acted decisively, cognizant of both practical and psychological consequences. By 2:15 a.m., action had commenced. Privileges were formally suspended, security measures adjusted, and communication channels tightened. Advisors executed the operational aspects, while Charles oversaw the process with the full weight of sovereignty. Every decision, from minor procedural adjustments to the public framing of the action, reflected his authority and judgment. Yet, even in this controlled environment, unpredictability remained. Human reaction, particularly within a family, is impossible to fully anticipate. Direct question to the audience. How would you feel if someone with immense authority, someone you respect and love, enacted measures that affected your life dramatically, and you had little time to respond? Charles had to anticipate not only institutional outcomes, but emotional repercussions. Each person affected by the privilege removal would interpret and react according to their own perspective, history, and emotions, creating a complex web of interpersonal dynamics that required careful navigation. The emotional tension was compounded by the historical lens. Monarchs are always aware of how their actions will be interpreted by history. A decisive, judicious approach preserves legacy. Missteps can tarnish reputation. Charles understood that this night's decisions would be scrutinized not only by those present, but by historians, journalists, and the public for years to come. This awareness added a layer of pressure that was both motivating and daunting, reinforcing the need for clarity, courage, and precision. By 2:45 a.m., the immediate operational tasks were complete, but the night was far from over. Charles knew that the next phase, monitoring reactions, managing communications, and anticipating consequences, would require continued vigilance. The removal of privileges was not merely a punitive measure. It was a realignment of authority and a reaffirmation of standards. Its impact would ripple through the family, staff, and institution, shaping interactions, perceptions, and decisions for weeks, months, and perhaps years. And then came the human reflection. Alone for a moment, Charles considered the personal cost of the night's events. Leadership demands action, often at personal and emotional expense. Decisions that preserve an institution may strain relationships, alter perceptions, and leave scars that cannot be seen but are deeply felt. For the king, this was the paradox of sovereignty, absolute responsibility paired with profound human vulnerability. By the first light of dawn, the palace had shifted. Privileges were removed, boundaries were reinforced, and the immediate crisis had been addressed. Yet the ripple effects were only beginning. Charles understood that the night's work would shape the dynamics between family members, influence public perception, and inform the narratives historians would later recount. The anomaly had sparked action that was swift, decisive, and emotionally charged, and the consequences would continue to unfold. Direct question to the audience. Could you maintain authority when the very people affected by your decisions are your own family? This is the challenge Charles confronted, a test of leadership, judgment, and emotional resilience. The night demanded courage, clarity, and foresight, and he delivered all three. Yet, even with the immediate crisis resolved, one truth remained. The story was far from finished.